Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dr. Deep State. I have a special guest today, Dr. Hughes from the UK. Before I formally introduce him, I would like to remind everybody that Dr. Deep State is a shadow banned channel. So if you ever want to share the information with your friends or if you want to find it yourself, it's usually not available on a Google search bar. You might want to just go directly into YouTube and type it in, and probably going to be able to get it. So we're going to speak about a number of topics today. And at the end, we got some touchy things and we might have to go over to our locals channel. So today we have, again, a special guest from the United Kingdom. His name is Dr. David Hughes. He is the senior lecturer at the University of Lincoln. He did his undergrad work at Oxford University, and he spent some time in his postgraduate work and graduate work over here at Duke University in the United States. He has two books, and we'd like to talk about both of them. The first book is titled COVID-19, Psychological Warfare and the War for Technocracy. Kind of a mouthful. So that looks exciting, and we might unpack parts of that, as well as his newest book, Wall Street and the Nazis, The Crimes of the Deep State. Dun, dun, dun. So happy to have you here with us, Dr. Hughes. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I'm enjoying the rare British sunshine today, and I'm very happy to be with you.
I wish we had some of that. We've had quite the rainy spell over here. A couple things that attracted me to Dr. Hughes' work was an interview I first heard 2 years ago, and he was talking about his experience of shifting his paradigm and kind of discovering the deep state. And he wrote an article. It was peer-reviewed, and I would like to have him speak to that. Dr. Hughes told me just a moment ago that he attended Christ College.
Christchurch.
Christchurch, yes. And I mentioned Christopher Wren. I was there for a year. I don't know if you ever met any students from St. Michael's Academy of Medieval and Renaissance Studies associated with Keble. I don't know if that's ringing a bell over there.
I did not know.
It was a good time. A lot of pints.
That sounds like Oxford, yeah.
So you were probably at your current post. You tell us your story. Is it 2017, 2018? What, for so many people, it was 9/11 itself, and something in your brain said, something ain't adding up here, and you started investigating. Can you explain that process? Then please set us up how you presented this peer-reviewed article to your peers and the response.
Right. So the key date for me, I still remember the exact day because it's kind of important, was the 8th of December 2016. And yeah, because it was such a moment. So I, at the time, was teaching US foreign policy. And I was reflecting on some of the similarities between the war in Vietnam and the war in Afghanistan. So I was thinking they're both very long wars, they're both very costly wars, kind of PTSD, and other things besides. And then I thought, well, the major escalation in the Vietnam War occurred after 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which has since been exposed to have been a false flag. So the war in Afghanistan, that kind of was kickstarted really by 9/11. That couldn't have been a false flag, could it? Surely not. Surely not. Surely, no, that's just conspiracy theory, right? So for the first time, I actually started looking at some of these online videos regarding, in the first instance, how the towers were destroyed in New York. And it only took me about an hour of just looking at the evidence for myself to understand, yep, we have been completely lied to. There is absolutely no way that airplanes and Muslim hijackers did this to these buildings. And of course, once you understand that, and it's very simple to understand in many ways. I mean, Building 7, if you look at the way that building is destroyed, you only really need a high school level of understanding of vectors, basic physics, basic principles of mathematics, to know that the only way that building could have come down as it did was if all of the core columns failed simultaneously. And the only way that that could have happened would have had nothing to do with falling debris from the Twin Towers. And of course, Building 7 was not struck by a plane either. So, I mean, it's actually really easy and really obvious.
In one sense, that's the paradox. It is, but why can, and so many things in reality are a click away. I remember for me, I remember the moment I was standing out in a next to a swimming pool in Long Island, and I had this stored on my head, something about Building 7, but I just never bothered investigating. I only looked at academic materials, so I went and I just looked at that, and then I thought, well, what is academia? Because this is a pursuit of truth in academia. So I think there was architects and engineers and so forth, and I think there needed to be some articles at that time for some sort of ventilation. This was like 2013, and so there was some material out there. There was a great philosophical argument. Name escapes me, from a Canadian, but so little. And then I went to the typical people that spoke so much truth. You've mentioned Noam Chomsky, and he's calling all these people armchair architects and engineers. And I thought, okay, so the idea of a gatekeeper opens up. Here's something before that. Teaching international relations myself, I noticed that we're kind of bound by a certain type of paradigm in there. We talk about Rockefeller education, but we assume that's in primary school. But just even teaching, I realized built into the models that we receive, that they have sort of a natural teleos or trajectory. In realism, in order to have perfect security, we need some kind of one world order. In liberalism, in order to find this perfect sort of exchange, we need some sort of one world order. In Marxism, in order to find this perfect justice, and then nationalism is it's just painted with such an ugly face that you kind of, students are automatically going to have to pick between one and the other, and there goes a type of dialectic right there. So that was also always kind of making me think, like, we're being forced into choosing this or this, and they all essentially have the same trajectory. If you teach the class, so maybe you've noticed something like that.
Yeah, well, the sociology of knowledge is particularly interesting. So in the case of international relations, it really only started crystallizing as a specific discipline with its own body of theory in the mid-1950s. So, I mean, for some decades prior to that, you had kind of international institutes and so on set up at some of the prestigious universities, and also the Council on Foreign Relations and so on. But in terms of actually becoming a discipline with its own brand of theory, that's distinct from political theory, that only really came about in the mid-1950s. And there was a key conference in 1954 that brought together almost exclusively realist thinkers for the purpose of kind of founding IR theory. But here's the thing. Guess who laid on that conference and sponsored it? The Rockefellers.
Yeah, not a shocker.
Everywhere you look, that name Rockefeller comes up. You know, the subversion of the teaching of history in US higher education, allopathic medicine, more recently anything to do with digital IDs and vaccine passports and all the rest of it. So it is quite astonishing, actually, how in particular that name, that family, that foundation has played such an enormous role in shaping our perception of reality, including through educational institutions. Now, if we come back to the 9/11 issue, I, like you, went straight to the academic literature because I thought, wow, this is unbelievable. This is the seminal event politically of the 21st century. And there is a clear body of primary empirical evidence here that can be examined. The significance of this kind of research could not be higher, because if this was all premised on lies, then essentially everything we think about the way the world works and political systems, democracy, national sovereignty, and many other things a big question mark needs to be put over all of it. So I was really keen to find out what was in the academic literature around the events of 9/11. So I did some digging, and I found very, very little. There were a couple of edited volumes going back to kind of 2006 to 2008 time, a few other bits and pieces besides, but really, really not very much at all. So I thought this is extraordinary, and particularly for a discipline like international relations, which of all academic disciplines, you would suspect or expect that if there is an understanding of terrorism and false flag terrorism, you'd find it in that discipline, which happened to be my own. So I was astounded that there was very, very little material. So I did the intellectually honest and responsible thing, and I wrote an article of my own about it, which was published in the journal Alternatives, which is a mainstream peer-reviewed IR journal. And it was, in some senses, it was a fairly simple article. It did three things. It said, first of all, why is it that academics refuse to look at the evidence regarding the events of 9/11, given how important it is and how obvious it is? Second, here's a load of evidence that you should look at. So if you haven't seen this before, academics, here it is. And I hit, I think, 36 separate points of evidence regarding just all manner of things, from the money flows to the destruction of the buildings to questions about the presence of hijackers at airports and much else besides. And then finally, the third part of the article speculated on some reasons why academics might not have touched this. Now, the key point really about this article is that once it was out there, the academic community in general had an intellectual, and I would also argue a moral responsibility to address it, because the claims it's making are extremely serious. So, in other words, if my argument were false, then it should be debunked. If the evidence I present were poor, then it should be called into question and dismissed. What I was hoping would occur would be a very lively intellectual debate surrounding this. I was hoping it, really might all kind of kick off once all of this evidence was put in front of the faces of the academic community in peer-reviewed mainstream format. So no longer can you say, "Oh, this is just conspiracy theory. This is just YouTube videos or whatever." No. This is serious academic literature, and it's attracted a huge amount of attention. Tens of thousands of reads, even at the paid access website of the publisher. So that suggests to me that it's mostly academics reading it, because the paid access will mean that it's university libraries that are providing the access. Tens of thousands of reads. And here's the astonishing thing. 4.5 years later, I think maybe 3 citations. It's basically been ignored. Now, this I find sinister, actually, that you can actually put the evidence very clearly in the appropriate format in front of the academic community worldwide. And many people want to read it. Many people are interested in it. Nobody dares comment on it. So this is a significant taboo, a significant blind spot, not just in IR, but in the whole of academia. And it raises profound questions, moral questions. Because if you have an entire profession that is unwilling and refuses to look at the evidence regarding the seminal political event of the 21st century, then it becomes complicit in everything that the events of 9/11 were used to legitimize. And we're talking here very serious things with the war on terror. We're talking imperialist wars of aggression, destabilization of the Middle East region, increased levels of surveillance and security, mounting authoritarianism, and ultimately the path which flowed into the next major operation, which was the COVID operation. And not to mention things like torture, of course, and drone warfare, all of the horrors which flowed from this entire war on terror paradigm. They are all premised on 9/11 and what took place on 9/11. So academia, in my opinion, bears massive moral culpability here for not looking at this, because the world has become a far worse place and a far darker and more horrific place because of all of what's unfolded since 2001. And if it's all based on lies and empirically demonstrable falsehoods, then it is surely the duty of the profession to call this out. And the fact that it hasn't done and refuses to do so is the major reason why I'm leaving it.
Yeah, good. One of the reasons is that the paradigm that we operate with in academics is positivism and reductionism. So to some extent, I think you pointed out that we just look at what is. We don't question why or what ladder we're leaning that wall against. So we're kind of given this paradigm that already kind of stick us in a certain cave in one sense, but to almost hop over to what's going on in the world today when we see language code shutting people down in college protests and so forth. That's a whole nother level of the techniques of totalitarianism. We can tap on Juice Malou in a moment if you'd like to, because I know you've extended that idea from the individual to the collective. But yeah, even speaking of the deep state, a name comes to me that it was a powerful article. In my videos, here at the channel, my video 1 through 104, I teach a class in unfolding the deep state from the construction of oligarchy on up. The title does come back to me. A philosophy professor. It was a moral decoding of 9/11, and I liked that article. And I'm sure stuff has maybe been done since then, but I was just shocked, and I still is. It's just a shutdown. Okay, before I was just going to mention with the Hans Morgenthau, if you've never run into this citation, it's from a white paper, both in 51 and 53, a bulletin dealing with nuclear war, when he pretty much lays out what you sometimes call gladio, that there will be a parapolitical government in place. So I just wanted to highlight that to you. But okay, this just popped into my head. Now, this might be kind of touchy for you, but just the people in the corridor, your colleagues, can you compare maybe the reaction 4 years ago? You typed, I mean, obviously, I kind of like to go, I really kind of like to stay kind of to myself where I work. But I think once you publish and it's peer reviewed, there has to be some sort of transparency. So you've seen the reactions 4 years ago compared to now. I bet some of them, now that your book's really getting some traction, there might even be some jealousy on their part. You probably don't want to comment on that. But can you see just generally? Okay, first of all, with the faculty, did it make you feel isolated, both because of the general audience out there of academics, plus more close to home?
Yeah, I mean, I can't comment on specific cases,
I understand.
but what I would say is as a general principle is that, and I mean, this is not this is referring to the academic community as a collective, is that there has been a form of intellectual ostracization. So the refusal to engage with the article is one form. Prior to 2020, I was routinely being accepted at the major conferences on the international circuit, no problem. Since then, of course, the only calls for paper submissions that I have made have been to do with essentially deep state material, because it's the most important thing that everyone needs to understand, not least IR scholars. And no invitations at all during that time. I adopted a deliberate policy at work because I really like my colleagues and get along really well with all of them. So I didn't want to jeopardize any of that. So I simply never, ever talked to any of them about the material that I was researching, which, I mean, it runs kind of counter to how things are supposed to work in academia. But the trouble is, once you understand about trauma-based mind control, cognitive dissonance, and so on, then you realize that there are certain taboo topics which, if you broach them, can actually induce a visceral reaction in someone who's either not heard it before or is too heavily propagandized or indoctrinated. And You can see as people go from kind of 0 to 100 in a few seconds sometimes, and I've heard many reports about this. So I'm very, very careful, not to drop it into everyday conversation, particularly with people that I like and value, or with certain loved ones and so on, because certain relationships are not worth jeopardizing. So therefore, there's just been a kind of eerie ostracization, as I say, where I don't talk about it and no one mentions it, no one asks any questions. And I find it really spooky because meanwhile, you've got this ever growing body of people out there who very clearly understand that things are wrong. They very clearly know in many cases that that 9/11 we were lied to about that. They recognize that there are seriously dark forces at work now in the world since 2020. Lots of people are, in inverted commas, waking up. This kind of material is no longer as taboo or ridiculed as it used to be, and yet academia appears to be the last branch of society to actually be catching up. So it's a very strange thing.
Yeah, that's a good answer, and that's what I wanted to go for. Just I think it's unique in the way that it just won't address what it ought to be addressing. I was very naive. Well, even in the early 2000s, I was very naive, having conferences about the Bush Doctrine and who are the characters behind this sort of planning for a new American century. And I was even kind of doing some, like, what exactly are their backgrounds and so forth. And early on, there was kind of an openness, and then there was a shutdown. But when I started in sort of 2014, 15, introducing this to students, people, either you get with the general population sort of the fluoride stare, or you get, like you were mentioning, people actually get triggered. So
but the problem in academia, I mean, this is what really gets me about it, is that fundamentally this is a matter of intellectual dishonesty.
Yeah.
If you are presented with very clear evidence and an accompanying hypothesis and a problematization of a particular narrative, then if you are honest intellectually, you need to look at that and you need to address it. And so as a profession, there is a profound level here of intellectual dishonesty. Now, maybe among certain other professions, which are known for being ruthless and cutthroat and so on, you might expect that. But academia should be the last profession where you'd expect to encounter this kind of thing. And it gets worse because, particularly when you look at the COVID era, not only is the tyranny and the worst aspects of everything that's happened widely ignored in academia, but there are numerous studies which are supporting it in various forms. So, for example, legal scholars providing justifications for mandatory vaccination, IT scholars providing more efficient algorithms that Twitter can use to censor, and this kind of thing. Academia has no problem at all in lining up on the side of power, but what it seems to me is that it has failed completely since 2020, if not earlier, in genuinely speaking truth to power, because so much of the prevailing power structures in the world today rest on deception, and it should be incumbent on academics to expose that deception, and it isn't happening.
No. Plato once said, when we receive the lie, if we don't check it, we become enchanted. In other words, he's suggesting there's a certain demonic ontology that we embrace, and I think that's gone on collectively. So I kind of look at that memetics, and I even have the word egregore that has been engaged in, and I have to go to that ethereal realm because I have no other way of explaining this rejection of reality. And that's what my material is on. We're embracing an ontological war over reality. And again, that comes back. You'll recognize this from Juice Malou, is that's exactly what the totalitarians do, attack consciousness and your very foundational grasp of reality in order to mold you to their, call it oligarchical or plutocratic project.
Yes.
let me switch over to you a bit. This is completely anecdotal. The students, and now I don't want you necessarily to address your students, but young people generally, what's your kind of feel compared to, I don't like to do the boomer this, but
Mm.
just generally with students nowadays, we have this idea that they're all zombified by the telephone. I go back and forth with a professor at Lyons in France, and he kind of reports similar to me that they are more than ever just attached to that reality. What are you picking up? Some other people maybe see that there is a counter trend. What do you see?
I've seen two trends going in opposite directions in recent years. The first is highly disturbing, and it has to do with rates of mental health problems. And this was even before 2020. And I've observed this at different institutions that I've worked at, speaking with wellbeing centres and so on. But the proportion of students reporting, particularly mental health issues, has gone up quite significantly over, let's say, the last 10 or 15 years. There could be many factors involved in that. For example, austerity and the difficulty of getting a job after university. I think it's probably mostly to do with the screens and with social media. This is the first young generation to have been raised on Facebook and Twitter and smartphones and all the rest of it, which are profoundly damaging. And they were designed to operate through kind of dopamine hits in the brain every time you get a like or a notification,
Yeah.
this kind of thing. So that's really disturbing to me because it seems to me that it's part of what I call the omni war, and in this aspect, it's a war against young people. It's a war against their minds, and that's highly disturbing. On the other hand, the more positive trend that I have seen has to do with openness to alternative narratives. So maybe 5 years ago, if I were to even make the slightest suggestion that it might be worth just examining the evidence for yourself, around let's say the destruction of the Twin Towers or whatever, there was a time when the knee-jerk conspiracy theory kind of would come straight out, the kind of Pavlovian conditioning. Fascinatingly, in recent years, and again, I tend not to bring this stuff up at all in my teaching, because it's kind of the third rail, isn't it? I mean, most people are not ready to go there, and have a kind of problem with that because it feels like self-censorship at times. You just got to be a bit careful. But nevertheless, I have had quite a few students in recent years who have told me quite openly, "Oh yeah, we understand that this is all deception. We understand about various key issues relating to deep structural events and so on, in a way which is actually quite kind of blasé. So I think a major shift in awareness has taken place, and I mean maybe it even has something to do with the first trend that they realise that they are profoundly under attack by the system. The system is not there for them, and they're starting to see through some of the foundational narratives that are being used for purposes of oppression. So yeah, it's been difficult to watch, but there are also some green shoots of cause for optimism.
Yeah, I see. I don't see much now and again. I think the events in the spring, which I think were initially, which I would rarely say organic, at Columbia University, that some of these prestigious colleges, there were people that spoke out and spoke to truth to power in a naive, probably, way in many cases. But I think we don't have, the distance to kind of judge exactly what's happened. But I think it did reveal a type of exceptionalism, as Carl Schmitt would say. And so in that sense, whoever can kind of transcend that order, in a sense, becomes the sovereign. And I think there's this exposing right now that there is a double standard, and we are living in a state of exception, obviously, in the last 5 years, but that got, I think, punctuated with students that came out. And so I think I can only guess how other students are going to be processing this, because these are the biggest, these are the best and the brightest of them. They're going to be kind of called, blue-haired people, or, to kind of channel that, kind of within the dialectic. And we don't have to continue on that too much. But I think it is an avenue of some. I think it's a positive avenue. I just think that even that there's people that had the backbone to put everything online and their careers online and speak truth to power. And so I sort of affirm what they were doing. I don't sort of, I absolutely affirm what they were doing in a world of sellouts, that everybody that's goes along to get along. But it did put on the radar exactly the price one will pay, and just how this is treated. And you can touch on that if you'd like before I get into your books.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the problem we found across different professions, isn't it? That essentially the professions have failed since 2020. So you have academia, which is not telling the truth about fundamental matters. You have medicine, which is disregarding basic principles of first do no harm and informed consent and everything, with the kind of coerced injection rollout. You have the media, which is certainly not a fourth estate anymore, if it ever was. It's not holding power to account in any shape or form. It's just doing the bidding of power. You have the political left, which has completely abandoned the working classes. You have the churches, which were all too ready to close their doors on the sick and the vulnerable and so on in 2020. And Justin Welby in this country saying, do what Jesus would do and go and get vaccinated. I mean, so right across the spectrum, actually, there has been a failure of the professions. And one of the ways in which it works is that people who do stick to their principles, who do stick to their guns, who do speak out, who do challenge power, they get fired or edged out of their profession in various ways, some more cunning than others. And actually, as I argue in Wall Street, the Nazis and the Crimes of the Deep State, this is exactly how ideological conformity was produced in Nazi Germany as well. There are certain narratives which must not be questioned. You can say and speak whatever you like, so long as it's not to do with those key narratives which enforce power. But that's just one of many very troubling continuities, I think, between now and 1930s Germany.
Yes, and we can tap on that probably in just a moment. But yeah, when I grew up, those events of World War II, it was always the question: how could this have happened to the most educated and cultured among
Correct.
probably in the realm of trajectory
How
of human
how could the land of Goethe and Beethoven and Mozart have produced the Holocaust? Exactly.
And now we kind of know that we're pliable to some of these techniques and
Yes,
the social engineering.
Yeah.
Okay, let's hit a little bit on your first book. That would be titled COVID-19 Psychological Warfare and the War for Technocracy. The big picture, the big parts. One of your influences is Patrick Woods, and I kind of post some of his work on there. But give us a kind of big trajectory there, please.
Right. So, I mean, the big picture which the book seeks to paint is that an undeclared global class war was initiated with what I call the COVID operation in 2020. The aim of that war is to collapse liberal democracy and replace it with global technocracy. And what we saw during the COVID era was the largest and most ferocious psychological warfare operation in history. And that, in my opinion, was the opening campaign in this longer war for technocracy. So, what is technocracy? It goes back to the 1930s and the context of the Great Depression, problems of capitalism regarding kind of booms and busts and supply and demand generating price in a very kind of unpredictable way. And the aim was to produce a system which would be more stable and reliable. So everything would be priced according to its energy cost of production. And what this means is that ultimately it's about the scientific management of society. So you have an elite group at the top called the Technate, and they get to control everyone and everything and all resources. And the idea originally was that this would be used for the greater good, of course, a totalitarian concept, but the more efficient redistribution of resources, in theory, should be able to create more leisure time for everybody, for instance. So the technologies for doing this were not available in the 1930s. They are now under the banner of SMART. But that idea of scientifically managing society, it never went away. If you go back to the original Technocracy study course from 1934, I think it was, right at the beginning there, technocracy is defined as the science of social engineering. So, in other words, it's kind of the opposite of democracy. It's not about people coming together, debating, discussing, disagreeing, etc., voting. It is about trying to model society according to scientific principles. Now, when we get to the mid 20th century, what we find is various thinkers such as Aldous Huxley, Bertrand Russell, Zbigniew Brzezinski, using terms such as scientific dictatorship. So, if ever there are any potential redeeming features that technocracy might have had in its 1930s instantiation, and there were few, but still the leisure time thing is good. But that starts to recede with the idea of scientific dictatorship, and you can see very clearly that the ruling class has cottoned onto this idea as a means of total social control. Now, David Rockefeller soon afterwards began his engagements with China, along with Zbigniew Brzezinski. And we see many decades then of Rockefeller funding going into China, particularly in R&D. And as Patrick Wood and Ian Davis and James Corbett and others have all argued in their different ways, what appears to have been the result is that China has become the world's first technate, the first actual instantiation of this political regime. So when you think about social credit scoring, for example, and the total surveillance and the use of drones kind of flying around apartment blocks during the lockdowns to keep order, all of this stuff is disturbingly consistent with ideas of technocracy. So the goal now that it's been established in China, the world's most populous country, appears to be to roll out this system to the rest of the world. And this is why we're seeing smart cities and so on being pioneered, the 15-minute city concept, smart meters, 5G and 6G to connect all of this stuff. And the ultimate aim is to be able to monitor, surveil and control everything and indeed everyone. It's a system of total control. So if they're successful in instituting this, I believe that it will result in a new form of slavery on a global scale. And what's really disturbing is that if this is done, it could potentially also be irreversible.
Yeah. I re-released a video from 7 years ago yesterday. You mentioned Bertrand Russell, the impact of society, the impact of science on society in 1952. And boy, does he just put it all out there.
Yes.
Yeah. And I know when you're speaking to people about your book, some people try to get their head. You reject the idea of neo-Marxism, and so do I. I think in operative terms, Etzione's concept of communitarianism is probably closest to the merger of fascism and communism. But if we have to slap labels on things, but it is a type of a neo-collectivism or a neo-feudalism, I think, that is very much at play here. It's kind of whether you want to say the best of both worlds or both. But yeah, and I think I like to go real deep. So I think a lot of these models were constructed to hit off each other in this trans-historical alchemical work. Let's go a little bit. I'm sure people want to hear about anything with Nazis in the title. That's a good one. Wall Street
Yeah.
and the Nazis, the crimes of the deep state. And I don't think you have to convince anybody here that there is a deep state. And actually, there was a robust literature on parapolitical governments that I was able to find, and insecurity studies there, because there's kind of alternative terms there. Okay, so you're drawing here, I think, pretty well from the Anthony Sutton and his books, and trying to kind of say, like, where are we now with that in terms of the trajectory? You have degrees, or at least a degree in German, so you have a background in there, and you made serious connections between we would say theology, the typology of what's going on there, and the typology of what's taking place there in the most fundamental kind of ways.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I can speak to that. So rather than typology, I'd say political economy of 1930s Nazi Germany, and the political economy of the West in particular since 2020. So yes, I did German at Oxford for 4 years, and then I did a master's degree in European literature, and then I did a PhD at Duke for another 4 years in German studies. So I have quite an extensive background in German history, and a lot of that included learning all about the Nazi past. Now, when I finally left German studies almost 20 years ago, unbelievably, I never thought that I'd pick this kind of stuff back up again. I never thought that knowledge of the Nazi past would become fundamental to understanding the present. However, everything that's unfolded since 2020 has proven me wrong in that respect. So what I do in the book is, early on in chapter 2, it's quite a long chapter, but it draws out many, many continuities and similarities between what took place in the 1930s in Nazi Germany and what has taken place in the West since 2020. And I then, in the subsequent chapters, sketch lines of historical continuity. So over time, from the ways, for example, that Wall Street was financing the rise of Hitler, the development of the Nazi war machine, and indeed World War II, and draw out the class relations in particular. So totalitarianism, I argue, has always, well, for the last 100 years or so, been the favored political regime of the ruling class, because it's the most brutal, direct, efficient way of disciplining the working classes and keeping them under control. So in that 1930s crisis of capitalism, Wall Street was funding the Nazis. It was funding, for example, the electrification of the Soviet Union as well, but also with the business plot, so-called, which was an attempted coup in the United States in 1933, again, funded by wealthy US financiers and industrialists. They wanted to destroy democracy in the United States as well in the 1930s and have fascism there too. So there was a very clear push for fascism and what later became known as totalitarianism on behalf of this primarily Anglo-American ruling class responsible for this. So therefore, it's no surprise that when World War II is all over, we find extensive recruitment of former Nazis by the US State Department and the CIA. We find former Nazis, often leading Nazis as well, being shipped out to live in various Western countries. We see denazification largely failing. Many senior Nazis back in positions of power, for example, in industry and politics in West Germany within maybe just 5 years or so of the end of the war. You mentioned Operation Gladio previously. Again, all of these things come together, the building of the transnational deep state, as I call it, in those latter years of the 1940s. The NATO stay-behind armies seem to have been part of this kind of clandestine, invisible network. They only came to light in 1990. And so I trace all of this right the way through. When we think about the Operation Gladio and the strategy of tension in Italy and the use of false flag terrorism to keep the population in fear, wrongly blame the left for these attacks. That very model was then globalized after 9/11 with the subsequent terror wars. And it all feeds in directly into what's happened during COVID and beyond. So, in the final part of the book, I conclude that given that this historical trajectory is non-accidental, there are reasons for it. It's a response to a major crisis in the system. The ruling class is seeking recourse to totalitarianism again now, only this time it's a novel biodigital form of totalitarianism. The point is that if we study history, we know where this all led in the 1930s in terms of the Holocaust, the War of Annihilation in the East, all of the war crimes and the rest of the Second World War. We know the worst horrors of Nazi Germany. Now, totalitarianism and its worst horrors don't just simply spring up overnight. Didn't all happen in 1933. There were years of laying the groundwork for what came later through various forms of legislation and cultural discrimination, changes to the education system, and so on. And I think that's the kind of similar intervening period that we're living in now, where there's been a major kind of seizure of power, if you like. Some of the emergency legislation passed in 2020 has obvious similarities to the Enabling Act. Much of the legislation which has subsequently passed has been pushing ever further in the direction of authoritarianism. If this trajectory continues, then, as I argue in chapter 7 of the book, we have some very unpleasant things to anticipate. So I conclude the book with a call really for resistance, and a worldwide attempt is needed now to put down this global technocratic coup, because the world could be plunged into totalitarian darkness of an absolutely diabolical, transhumanist, kind of biodigital, technocratic nature. It doesn't bear thinking about, but the trouble is it's all real, it's all coming for us, and we have to stop it.
Yeah, I think we can maybe end in a moment when we flip over here to bio-digital convergence, which will probably be a hallmark of transhumanism. Yes, and when people, I think, have in mind this kind of accidental history where one damn thing just happens after another, they sometimes say history rhymes. But when you think that there could be a cabal directing certain events, then the fact that these are repeating kind of takes on another sense of meaning. There was actually, of course, all the drama that happened in the intervening years in Germany. So there's a lot of trauma there. Television was introduced. But yeah, at the end of this, it's sort of funny. Some Nazis were tried at Nuremberg, and some went off to run international organizations and even space agencies. So isn't that crazy? So unless you kind of get to the fulcrum of this and see this, I think, as a trans-historical project and really step back, it all just seems kind of things where we get lost in the trees. And I think you did a good job of working with Sutton's work there. I want to talk about the ingredients. I really liked what you did, some of these self-assembling particles, and a little bit about what you called the war of good and evil. And we want to finish on that. Unfortunately, these are topics. I have currently one strike going for me, so I cannot talk about this. So I am going to jump over with Dr. Hughes onto the locals, and we're going to finish up there talking about the little bit of the science and pulling things together. So that we're going to conclude part 1 for now. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.